Far out in the eastern Pacific Ocean, almost 600 miles from the coast of Ecuador, lie a scattered chain of volcanic islands. They rise from the sea like the bones of a sleeping giant, black rock and mist, their shores laced with drifting fog. The world knows them as the Galapagos Islands, the Enchanted Isles. For centuries, sailors feared them. Old maps called them cursed, barren lands where compasses spun and water vanished. Yet nature thrived here. Tortoises that could live a century, iguanas that swam like dragons, birds unafraid of man. This was where Charles Darwin once walked, gathering clues that would change science forever. But long after Darwin, others came chasing not knowledge, but peace. They saw in the Galapagos a promise, a new Eden, where modern life could not follow. Few understood how harsh such beauty could be. Among those dreamers was a man from Germany, a doctor who no longer believed in society or even in comfort. His name was Friedrich Ritter, and in the summer of 1929, he would sail into the heart of this silence, seeking paradise at the edge of the world. Dr. Friedrich Ritter had once practiced medicine in Berlin. Brilliant, restless, disillusioned. He rejected city life, declaring that civilization had become a sickness of the soul. To be cured, he said, one must return to nature and live by its law alone. With him came Dorstrauss, a schoolteacher also from Germany. She left behind a husband, a comfortable home, and a future that no longer felt her own. Together they sold their belongings, studied survival, and announced to startled friends that they would build a new life on a deserted island, a life without machines, without rules, and without the noise of mankind. They chose Floreana Island, one of the smallest in the Galapagos chain. It had no harbor, no inhabitants, only volcanic rock, goats, and freshwater springs hidden in the hills. Their friends called it madness. To Ritter and Dorr, it was freedom. When they arrived, they planted a small garden, built a hut from driftwood, and began writing letters to Europe, describing their new existence. Those letters would soon travel farther than they ever imagined. At first, life on Floreana was exactly what they had dreamed. They rose with the sun, bathed in the cool stream, and worked by the rhythm of the tides. Dorr tended the garden. Ritter studied the strange plants that grew from lava. They lived on fruit, fish, and rainwater, and for a time, peace. But isolation has its own voice. At night, the wind carried sounds that were not wind, stones shifting, waves echoing like footsteps. The stars seemed close enough to touch, yet the silence between them felt endless. Dorr began keeping a journal. Her entries moved between wonder and unease. By late 1930, their letters describing a self-made paradise reached newspapers across Europe. Readers were captivated. The doctor and his companion who had renounced the modern world and found Eden reborn. Soon other settlers decided they would join them. Floreana would not stay quiet for long. Word of the Adam and Eve of the Galapagos spread quickly through Europe. Magazines printed their letters beside photographs of sea lions and volcanic cliffs. To readers weary of war and modern life, Floreana seemed a dream, a place where one could begin again. In 1932, another German couple arrived, Heinz and Margaret Wittmer. Heinz was a former captain. Margaret, practical and determined, was several months pregnant. They too sought simplicity and freedom. At first, Ritter welcomed them cautiously, offering advice on farming and water collection. But peace in paradise has limits. Soon there were small disagreements over supplies and land. The island that had once belonged only to 2 now had 4, soon to be 5, when Margaret's child was born. A new rhythm formed on Floreana, one divided between cooperation and quiet resentment. Still, life continued. The settlers built gardens, traded with passing boats, and learned to endure the loneliness together. Then, one morning, a third boat appeared on the horizon. It carried a woman who would change everything. She called herself Baroness Eloise von Wagner Bosquet, though no record of that title has ever been found. Elegant, theatrical, and commanding, she stepped ashore in silks and jewelry that gleamed in the equatorial sun. With her were 2 younger men, Rudolf Lorenz and Robert Philipson, her self-proclaimed companions. The Baroness announced that she intended to build a luxury retreat, Hotel Paradiso, for wealthy travelers seeking adventure. Her confidence stunned the island's quiet residents. Ritter was furious. Dorr called her presence an invasion of vanity. The Wittmers tried to remain neutral, but even they sensed trouble. Within days, the Baroness began taking over the island's limited resources, fruit, tools, and even the settlers' mail to ships passing by. She posed dramatically for visiting photographers and told exaggerated stories about her life in Europe. To some, she was charming. To others, she was dangerous. And from the moment she arrived, the peace of Floreana began to wither. The months that followed were filled with tension. The Baroness demanded attention, her laughter echoing across the island like a challenge. Ritter tried to ignore her, but her presence disturbed the fragile balance he and Dorr had built. Dorr's journal entries grew darker. "The air feels heavy," she wrote. "Even the birds have grown quiet." The 2 men who accompanied the Baroness began to quarrel. Lorenz, the younger, grew sickly and timid under her constant cruelty, while Philipson became possessive and volatile. Their arguments carried through the night, disturbing even the Wittmers' camp on the other side of the island. Small acts of sabotage began to appear: stolen crops, tools missing, footprints circling huts in the sand. Each group blamed the others. Ritter called it the madness of isolation. The Baroness called it jealousy. The island listened and kept its secrets. Floreana, once their sanctuary, had begun to turn against them. By early 1933, Floreana had split into 3 uneasy camps. Ritter and Dorr clung to their creed of simple living. The Wittmers sought steady work and quiet, raising their child among sea lions and wind. The Baroness ruled her camp like a stage, with Lorenz and Philipson as reluctant actors. Conflicts flared over water from the spring, over fruit trees, over the best ground for gardens. On an island this small, every footstep felt like trespass. Ritter began posting notes on driftwood stakes. "Do not touch these plants. This path is ours." The Baroness responded by walking those paths in bright silk, smiling as she passed. Passing boats brought supplies and carried stories. Sailors heard the Baroness boast of Hotel Paradiso, of grand suites, and a private pier. They also heard Ritter call her a menace and a fraud. The Wittmers, careful with words, told visitors only that the island was no longer peaceful. Letters left with the mailboats reached Europe and the mainland, each telling a different truth. Ritter wrote that vanity had invaded Eden. Dorr wrote that jealousy had a face and a laugh. The Baroness wrote that she had tamed a kingdom of rock and flame. Under the equatorial sun, gardens wilted and tempers sharpened. At night, lanterns flickered across the lava like distant signals. Paradise had drawn its lines, and everyone could see them. Tourist yachts began to arrive, drawn by newspaper tales of the new Eden. Well-dressed passengers stepped ashore to find huts of driftwood and cactus fences, and a Baroness greeting them with a practiced smile. She posed for photographs, claimed she would soon build a runway, promised a dining room with a view of whales. Ritter refused to perform. He offered water and advice, then returned to his tools. Dora watched carefully, noting which visitors left food or medicine in the Baroness camp, and which quietly handed flour or soap to the Wittmers. The island had become a ledger of favors, a currency of survival measured in tins and rope. Lorenz grew thinner. Sometimes he slept on the sand to escape the Baroness' temper. Philipson, taller and harder, followed him like a shadow. There were nights when voices rose to shouts that carried down the ravines. In the morning, footprints circled the water casks and vanished into scrub. One captain reported that the Baroness had commandeered mail, opening letters meant for others. Another said she hinted at a pistol. Ritter warned the crews to keep distance. The Wittmers asked only for tools and peace. Floreana's fame grew with every ship's log. So did its danger. Visitors sailed away with stories. Those who remained kept their silence and watched the horizon. In the heat of 1934, a rumor moved through the camps like dry grass catching fire. The Baroness said she had received an invitation to sail to Tahiti with a wealthy friend, that a yacht would soon anchor off Floreana and carry her away. She spoke of coral beaches and a hotel she would build there, grander than anything in the islands. Ritter laughed in private and called it a performance. Dor wrote that the island felt lighter when the Baroness spent her days packing trunks she did not own. Lorenz, desperate, begged passing boats for a berth off Floreana, saying he could no longer endure the life he was living. Philipson grew more possessive, more silent. Then the heat broke with a squall. Wind tore at the palms. Footprints crossed and recrossed the sand near the Baroness camp. A lantern burned at noon, then went dark. By evening the island was quiet, in a way none of them had heard before. The next day came and went without silk on the path, without laughter on the wind. The Baroness was gone. So was Philipson. Lorenz appeared at the Wittmer hut, pale and shaking, saying little, staring often toward the empty sea. He asked for water, for rest, for passage on the next boat to anywhere. No yacht had anchored. No sails had been seen. On Floreana, Paradise had finally found its spark, and the first shadow of a greater darkness fell across the sand. Morning came with a sky as clear as glass. There were no footprints leading to the shore, no sign of a launch, no signal from the ridge. At the Baroness shelter, a kettle stood cold, a trunk lay half-packed, a silk scarf clung to a thorn, as if the wind had tried to carry it away. Ritter walked the paths in widening circles, counting steps, reading the sand the way a doctor reads a pulse. Dor followed in silence, recording fragments in her journal. Shoes missing, a blanket gone, a lantern empty of oil. The island felt hollow, like a shell with the sound of the sea trapped inside. By midday, Lorenz appeared at the Wittmer hut, asking for water and rest. His clothes were dusty, his voice thin, his eyes fixed on distances. He said the Baroness had departed suddenly with a visitor bound for Tahiti, that she would send word when she reached a safe harbor. No one on Floreana had seen a sail. Passing captains were questioned over the next weeks. None reported anchoring off Floreana. None carried a passenger calling herself a Baroness. In the Wittmer account recorded years later, the Baroness left of her own will. Indoors writing, absence felt like erasure, too clean, too quick. Ritter drafted a letter for the mainland, missing persons, circumstances unclear, request for inquiry when a government cutter next called. But ships were rare, and the sea kept its counsel. On a small island far from every clock and courthouse, truth became a tide, rising, falling, carrying different stories on each wave. Toward evening, Lorenz asked again for passage on the next boat to any other island. No one argued. Even the birds were quiet. Floreana had lost a voice, perhaps two, and the silence pressed on every door. In the weeks that followed, Lorenz drifted between camps, sleeping at the Wittmers when fever came, sitting at the shoreline when it passed. He spoke little, avoided Ritter, and watched the horizon as if a promise might appear there. By late 1934, a small fishing craft anchored off the lava ledge. Its captain was a Norwegian seaman used to the currents of these islands, tough, practical, accustomed to voyages that lasted as long as the weather allowed. Lorenz begged for passage to a larger settlement, any port with a doctor, any place not called Floreana. They left with the morning tide, 2 men, a cask of water, dried fish, a compass that had known better days. The sea between the islands can look gentle from shore, but wind builds quick in those channels, and the swell can twist a small boat like a loose nail in a hinge. Days turned uncertain. The current drew them wide of their course. The sun stripped the water from their mouths. The islands became mirages, lifting and falling on heat. Whether the cask leaked or the route failed, no record can say, only that a landfall never came where they expected one. Months later, fishermen exploring an uninhabited shore found what the sea keeps when it gives nothing back, a light craft ruined among rocks, and 2 bodies laid out by wind and salt until the desert air mummified them. Among the possessions were items that spoke a name even when voices could not. Clothing recognized, a notebook, small tools once seen on Floreana. The island without people had gathered 2 more, and the story that began with a promise of Tahiti had now reached a shore where no one lives. News reached Floreana in pieces, a word from a deckhand, a line in a log, a captain's brief account traded for fresh fruit and water. Lorenz was gone, the Norwegian mariner gone, found on a barren island where even the sea lions seldom sleep. With that report, the island's balance shifted again. Ritter grew sharper in speech, protective of paths and tools. Dor more watchful, her journal turning from wonder to witness. The Wittmers kept working in steady rhythm, tending their child, gathering driftwood, acknowledging fate with the restraint of people who choose to remain. What of the Baroness? What of Philipson? Those questions moved like shadows at noon. Some said a quarrel turned to departure. Others said the sea took them in a moment of chance. Others lowered their voices and let the silence speak. No letters arrived to settle any line. No harbor master wrote a name that matched. Authority was distant. A patrol might call once in a season. A clerk might copy a statement in the next. But law travels slowly over blue water, and by the time it arrives, the sand has lost the first footprints. By the year's end, Floreana was changed beyond any letter that had once charmed Europe. Eden had narrowed to gardens fenced against wind, to water guarded by habit, to faces that had learned to show nothing. Where there had been performances, there was now only work, Where there had been laughter, there was now the patient sound of tide on rock. And beneath that sound another waited, a final turn in the story, the day when the doctor himself would fall to a meal he should never have eaten. After word came of Lorenz and the Norwegian found dead on that empty shore, Floreana seemed to grow smaller. The island had already taken the Baroness and Philipson into its silence. Now it had claimed the man who tried to leave. Ritter walked with a new stiffness, as though each stone underfoot might withhold a secret. He argued more often with Dor, correcting her work in the garden, her way of stacking driftwood, her thoughts spoken aloud. He had once preached harmony with nature. Now his words often turned to warnings about people. The Wittmers maintained their quiet routine. Margaret's entries in later years describe those months as heavy but workable. Two households separated by distance and temperament. They shared little, but they did not openly fight. On a small island, survival sometimes means speaking less rather than more. Dor's journal grew sharper. She wrote of feeling watched, not only by the others, but by the land itself. The black lava seemed to hold memory, the cactus spines like quills ready to write stories in anyone's blood. She described Ritter as proud, controlling, convinced that only his vision of Eden was worthy. Food was simple but scarce. The settlers lived on fruit, vegetables, goat's milk, and what little grain or sugar passing ships could spare. Ritter, a strict vegetarian, scorned meat as poison, believing it dulled the mind and enslaved the body. He had left that world behind in Berlin, but Floreana had its own opinions. In late 1934, the weather grew drier. Crops struggled, water sources shrank, and tempers hardened with the ground. When a ship brought a small supply of provisions, any item beyond the usual staples felt like a gift from another life. One day, according to the Wittmer account, canned meat was opened and prepared. It was an unusual choice for Ritter, the man who had renounced flesh entirely. Yet that day he ate, whether from weakness, persuasion, or a rare surrender to circumstance. No one can say with certainty. Shortly afterward, he fell violently ill. Pain seized his stomach. His body shook. His words, once measured and commanding, slipped into fragments between gasps. He accused Dor of poisoning him, then withdrew the accusation, then returned to it as the fever rose. On an island so small, there was nowhere for accusation to go but into the air. Dor later wrote that she had cooked the meal as any other, that fate alone chose its effect. Margaret, in her own memoir, described the scene as she saw it. A proud man, brought low, raging against the possibility that his own choices had led him there. No doctor could be summoned, no hospital lay within reach. Ritter, who had once practiced medicine in Berlin, must now face his final hours with the knowledge of exactly what his failing body was doing. The man who had come to the islands to cure his soul now lay on the same earth, beyond any cure. On Floreana, the line between accident and intention blurred once more. The island had taken another voice. Dor's description of that day would later differ in tone from the Wittmers, though the shape of events remained the same. She wrote of Ritter's anger, his accusations, his collapse, of trying to care for a man who had become both mentor and judge, partner and warden. The Wittmers recalled a calmer scene, of Dor arriving to ask for help, of Margaret bringing what comfort she could, of a final confession from Ritter that he had, in fact, poisoned himself by abandoning his own rules. whether that confession was spoken, implied, or imagined afterwards. No one can now prove. Ritter died on Floreana, the island he had chosen as his Eden. He was buried in the volcanic soil he once praised as pure. No autopsy was ever performed. No samples sent to a laboratory on the mainland. The cause was listed simply as food poisoning on a remote island. That phrase can hide many possibilities. With his death, the philosophy that had drawn him there broke apart. Dor remained, at least for a time, occupying the same hut whose walls had heard every argument. The Wittmers continued their life as before, though now their numbers and their claim to stability outweighed any other. When ships called, they heard different versions of the same story. Some captains wrote that paradise had turned tragic through fate alone. Others hinted at darker currents swirling beneath the calm surface of daily work. Each account added another layer to the mystery rising from this one small island. Floreana had started as a blank page for those who fled the world. Now, its story read like a novel, with pages missing, torn out by wind, by time, and perhaps by human hands. After Ritter's death, Floreana settled into a quieter, emptier rhythm. The Baroness and Philipson were gone. Lorenz and the Norwegian mariner gone. Now the doctor, too. Only Dor Strauch and the Wittmer family remained to carry the story forward. For a time, Dor tried to continue the life she had once chosen. She tended the same garden, fetched water from the same spring, slept under the same roof, where arguments and ideals still seemed to echo. But without Ritter, the island felt changed, not a shared sanctuary, but a room filled with the memory of one dominant voice. She visited the Wittmers more often. Margaret remembered her as weary, often ill, caught between loyalty to a dream and the growing pull of departure. On a small island, the choice to stay or go becomes not just practical but moral, as if leaving is a verdict passed on everything that happened. Eventually, a ship arrived that offered more than trade. It offered passage home. Dor accepted. The woman who had once sailed from Germany in search of a new world now stepped aboard to return to the old one, older herself, carrying a story that no one on the mainland yet understood. As the boat drew away, Floreana receded into haze, black rock fading into blue, goats picking their way over stone as if nothing had changed. The Wittmers remained on shore, a small family in a vast landscape, choosing stability where others had chosen escape. Dor would never see the island again, but she would not leave it behind. On the long journey back to Europe, the story of Eden began to reshape itself into something else, a testimony, a warning, and in some ways, a reckoning. Back in Germany, Dor set about writing her account of Floreana. The book would be published under the title Satan Came to Eden, a name that suggested from the start that paradise had been an illusion. Her words carried the weight of someone who had survived both illness and isolation, both devotion and disillusion. In her version, Ritter was brilliant but domineering, a man whose quest for purity became a cage for everyone around him. The Baroness appeared as a force of chaos, theatrical, manipulative, willing to twist anyone to her story. Lorenz emerged as a tragic figure, weakened by abuse and circumstance. The Wittmers, in Dor's telling, were practical but sometimes silent, where she believed they might have spoken. She did not claim to know exactly what happened to the Baroness and Philipson. She described tensions, threats, shifting alliances, then a vanishing that left behind no witnesses and many questions. Her prose was vivid, sometimes bitter, sometimes poetic. Readers sense truth and pain, but also the distortions that memory and emotion can bring. The book attracted attention. Newspapers revisited the story they had once framed as a simple tale of brave settlers. Now it was something darker, a case where isolation, ego, and secrecy turned an island into a stage for human frailty. Yet Dorr's account was only one lens. On Floreana, another version of events was still being lived every day, written not in ink, but in the steady routine of the family who never left. While Dorr's book took shape in Europe, Heinz and Margaret Wittmer remained on Floreana, raising their children and tending the land. For them, the island was not a symbol or a cautionary tale. It was simply home. Years later, Margaret published her own memoir about those years, offering a quieter, more measured narrative. In her telling, the Baroness did indeed announce plans to leave, then disappeared with Philipson in a way that suggested departure, not violence. She described Lorenz as troubled, but not necessarily victim, and emphasized the harshness of the climate and the difficulty of survival above all else. Ritter's death to Margaret was tragic but natural. Food poisoning in a place where medical help was far beyond reach. She wrote of Dorr with a mixture of sympathy and reservation, suggesting that illness and strain had shaped her view of events. Where Dorr saw demons in Eden, Margaret saw flawed people struggling in extreme circumstances. The two women's accounts did not cancel one another. They overlapped like images printed on thin paper, each revealing and obscuring details of the other. Between them lay the space where the truth might sit, quiet, unreachable, like a cove hidden behind black rock. Meanwhile, the Wittmer family grew. Children played among lava stones, goats grazed, rain barrels filled and emptied with the seasons. Tourists occasionally arrived, hearing that once, long ago, a baroness had ruled this island and vanished, as if swallowed by the sea. They found instead a modest homestead and a family that had outlived the storm. Floreana had moved on, but the world beyond it was only beginning to realize how strange its story truly was. As the 1930s turned into the 40s and 50s, the strange events on Floreana traveled beyond letters and memoirs. Sailors carried the tale from port to port. Journalists retrieved old clippings. Travelers arriving in the Galapagos asked guides where the Baroness Island could be found. A story once known only to a handful of settlers had begun its slow drift into legend. The governments of Ecuador and Germany each made brief inquiries, though distance and limited communication rendered any official investigation symbolic. The Galapagos lay far from the reach of city courts, far from witnesses, far from any legal structure that could press for answers. Floreana remained what it had always been, a place where truth moved at the speed of boats and wind. Tourists who visited in later decades found remnants of the old camps, rusted tools, stone outlines of gardens, driftwood gates shaped by sun and memory. Some claimed to find footprints that seemed too deliberate. Others said they heard whispers in the surf near the Baroness' former hut. Most left with the sense that the island held more than it revealed. Interest surged again in the 1960s when Dorr's book resurfaced in new printings. Readers fascinated by remote living, an existential philosophy found in her words a haunting mixture of confession and accusation. It sparked debates that scholars still revisit. Who among the settlers spoke truth? Who embellished? And who remained silent out of necessity? Floreana's history had become a puzzle with missing pieces, and each decade added another attempt to solve it. As the 20th century advanced, filmmakers began to visit the islands with cameras drawn to the volcanic cliffs and the strange beauty that had once lured the settlers there. Old reels of footage surfaced showing the Baroness posing dramatically for early travelers, Ritter with a stern gaze, Dorr moving carefully through the rough garden paths. These fragments were woven into documentaries, each shaped by the perspective of its creators. Some emphasize the philosophical clash between Ritter and the world he rejected. Others highlighted the Baroness' flamboyance and the triangle of tension surrounding her. The absence of definitive answers made the story irresistible. Every retelling filled the gaps in a different way. In later years, one of the most notable film explorations was the Galápagos Affair, Satan Came to Eden, which blended archival material with narration from the settlers' own writings. For many viewers, it was the first time they saw the real faces behind the myth, captured in grainy black and white as they worked the land that would shape their fate. The movie introduced a new generation to the mystery. Viewers debated motives on forums, scholars revisited the primary letters, tourists began requesting specific sites on Floreana. A story once nearly forgotten had become a strange cultural landmark, halfway between documentary fact and campfire tale. It is in these retellings that the mystery of Floreana deepened rather than faded, for the more people examined the events, the more the shadows lengthened. Today, researchers studying the Galapagos often mention the affair as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how isolation amplifies human nature, how paradise on paper can become a crucible in practice. Yet scientists are not the only ones drawn to it. Writers, psychologists, and adventurers also examine the case, each seeking to understand what truly happened on that lonely volcanic island nearly a century ago. Some point to environmental strain, scarce water, extreme heat, hunger, the psychological weight of endless silence. Others suggest clashing personalities, mismatched dreams, the dangers of unaddressed power dynamics in a place with no laws. A few argue for darker interpretations, citing conflicting statements and the uncanny timing of each disappearance. But no matter the angle, all agree on one thing: the truth is fragmented. Letters contradict journals. Memories shift from year to year. Testimonies blur under the pressure of time. Even the landscape changes as vines reclaim ruins and wind smooths the last outlines of old paths. What remains is a story held between two realities, the documented facts and the enduring mystery. The settlers came to Floreana seeking purity and peace, but the island offered them something far more complex. It offered isolation, desire, rivalry, survival, and the kind of unresolved ending that belongs not to fiction, but to life itself. And so, nearly 100 years later, the Galapagos Affair continues to resist closure, its unanswered questions drifting like mist among the lava fields. While the world debated what had happened on Floreana, the Wittmer family remained the quiet constant in the story. Heinz and Margaret continued raising their children among the lava stones and salt wind, growing crops, keeping goats, repairing tools that had been used by settlers who no longer lived. For them, life after the affair was not a tale of mystery, but one of work and perseverance. Their homestead became a modest landmark for visitors. Passing sailors were offered water and fruit, sometimes stories. but never sensational ones. The Wittmers spoke simply and cautiously, more interested in practicality than in legend. To them, Ritter had been brilliant, but inflexible, Dor fragile, the Baroness dramatic but not monstrous, and Floreana itself unchanged in its harsh beauty. Their perspective added something missing from the more dramatic accounts, the reality that everyday life continued. Children laughed, goats wandered the ravines, days passed in rhythm with sunrise and tide. Even as newspapers turned the island into myth, the Wittmers lived in its ordinary truth. Yet visitors often reported a different feeling. They described the strange quiet around the Baroness' former hut, the sense that the island held memory like a sealed jar, the way certain ravines felt colder than the rest of the land. Floreana did not need theatrics to feel haunted. Nature provided the atmosphere, and human history provided the shadows. Years later, the Wittmers built a small lodge where travelers could stay. Those who slept there spoke of hearing wind that seemed to mimic voices, of dreams filled with desert paths, of a feeling that someone unseen was walking just ahead of them. Floreana never forgot its story, and neither did anyone who set foot upon it. Today, Floreana stands quieter than most of the Galapagos Islands. It has no sprawling resorts, no crowds, just a handful of families and the echoes of those who came seeking perfection nearly 1 century ago. Visitors exploring the island often retrace the footsteps of the settlers. They walk the sandy path leading to Post Office Bay, where mariners once left letters in barrels. They visit the spring where water was rationed, the clearings where gardens once grew, and the barren ridge where the Baroness posed for photographs that now feel like scenes from a dream. Many report an indescribable mood. It is not fear, not exactly sadness, but a sense of unfinished business, a weight, perhaps, formed by the combination of silence, isolation, and the knowledge that the island once held strong personalities in close confinement. The volcanic rock absorbs sunlight by day and radiates it at night, adding a subtle shimmer to the air that blurs distance and time. Guides often share both versions of the story, Dor's darker interpretation and Margaret Wittmer's steadier one. Most visitors find themselves leaning toward one or the other, choosing the narrative that feels truest to them. The affair becomes not just history, but a mirror reflecting what people believe humans are capable of in extreme conditions. Some travelers swear they hear footsteps near the old camps after sunset. Others claim to see flickers of movement in the cactus shadows. Rational explanations exist, but in a place shaped by volcanic fire and human passion, certainty is the rarest resource of all. Floreana invites every visitor to decide for themselves what the island still remembers. Nearly 100 years after the affair, the story continues to fascinate because it refuses to settle into a single version. Every retelling adds another angle. Every diary entry and letter contains a shadow of bias. Every survivor remembered the past through a different emotional lens. What happened to the Baroness and Philipson? Did they truly leave for Tahiti? Or did something happen on that hot day in 1934 that no one wished to write down? Why did Lorenz die on an island so desolate it seemed designed to erase footprints? Was Ritter's final meal truly an accident, or simply one more event shaped by pride, exhaustion, and the fragility of human judgment? Experts have examined the case for decades. Some point to psychological strain. others to romantic rivalry, others to the dangers of frontier living with no medical support and no authority to intervene. A few suggest foul play, though evidence remains elusive. On Floreana, even hard facts become soft at the edges, worn down like lava glass by wind and time. What remains is not a solved mystery, but a living one. A story retold because its contradictions invite endless interpretation. An island that appears tranquil yet holds a history as dramatic as any novel. And perhaps most striking of all, a reminder that paradise can fracture not because of evil alone, but because of the complexities people bring with them. The Galápagos Affair endures because it is not a single truth, but many truths layered together. Floreana still sits in the Pacific, quiet and sunlit, keeping its secrets exactly where they have always been, just out of reach. As the decades passed, Floreana changed slowly, shaped more by wind and tide than by human hands. Ruins of the early camps faded into the landscape, fence posts worn to stumps, foundations swallowed by creeping vegetation. Only fragments remained to suggest the lives once lived here: a rusted kettle, a cracked water barrel, stones arranged in a pattern that once marked a garden. Modern archaeologists have examined these remnants with respectful caution. They note the simplicity of the structures, the resourcefulness required to survive with so little, and the clear signs that each household lived in increasing separation. But archaeology cannot answer the deeper questions: the motives, the emotions, the turning points that shaped the tragedy. The Wittmer homestead survived the longest. Their descendants maintained huts and pathways, offering a tangible link between past and present. Visitors arriving by small boats often say the place feels frozen in time, as if the island paused the day the Baroness vanished and simply refused to restart. Even today, those who walk the inland trail toward the Baroness' former shelter report a strange sensation. The site sits on a slight rise, surrounded by scrub and jagged lava. There is no sign of struggle, no memorial, just a whisper of wind threading through cactus spines. Yet many describe feeling watched, not by people, but by the memory of all that unfolded. Floreana preserves its past not through artifacts, but through atmosphere. Its emptiness is part of its story, a silence that holds more truth than any official record. Over the years, researchers, historians, and true crime investigators have attempted to reconstruct the events of 1934. Their theories fall into several broad categories, each compelling, none definitive. Some scholars argue that the Baroness and Philipson simply left as Lorenz claimed. They note that the Baroness often boasted of exotic plans, and that sudden departures were not uncommon among restless adventurers. But skeptics ask why no ship reported taking them, why no port logged their arrival, and why all traces vanished so completely. Others believe the pair met with violence, whether accidental or deliberate. Tensions were documented, confrontations witnessed, jealousies whispered among visitors, but without bodies, without confessions, and without neutral witnesses, certainty remains elusive. There is also the theory that the environment itself played a role. Floreana is unforgiving: limited water, relentless heat, distances that deceive the eye. A misstep into a ravine or an attempt to reach a distant ship could have resulted in an unseen tragedy. If nature claimed them, the island's shifting dunes and lava fields would erase evidence within days. As for Ritter, academics debate whether his death was purely accidental food poisoning or a final act shaped by exhaustion and conflict. Some suggest he knowingly ate meat that had spoiled. Others interpret his accusations toward Dor as fever-induced. The truth may lie somewhere between physiology and psychology. Historians agree on only one point. The affair endures because it resists every attempt to narrow it into a single explanation. Today, visitors travel to Floreana seeking wildlife and scenery, but almost all leave speaking about the human story instead. The island's legacy is not only its tortoises, its volcanic cliffs, or its black sand. It is the unresolved narrative of the settlers who came seeking paradise and found something far more complicated. Guides recount the affair with care, aware that much of the tale exists between verified fact and remembered experience. They lead guests to the spring where water was life, to the ridge where the Baroness once stood, to the quiet path where Ritter walked in philosophical solitude. The story has become a symbol, a study of human nature under pressure, idealism, rivalry, passion, isolation. Every element collided on Floreana. What should have been a sanctuary became a crucible, revealing strengths and weaknesses in equal measure. The Wittmer descendants remain part of the island's living memory. Their presence offers continuity, a reminder that survival was possible, that harmony could exist even where others experienced only turmoil. To meet them is to touch a thread that stretches back nearly 1 century. For many visitors, the most striking realization comes at sunset. As the sky turns gold behind the silhouettes of cacti, the island seems to exhale. It is peaceful yet not empty. It feels as though the past listens quietly from behind the rocks, not threatening, simply present. Floreana's legacy is neither horror nor romance, but a human truth preserved by wind absence and the enduring power of mystery. Even now, nearly 100 years after the settlers stepped ashore, the Galapagos Affair continues to perplex investigators. True crime researchers examine the case as if it happened yesterday, mapping timelines, comparing diary entries, analyzing inconsistencies. Some argue that the truth is hidden in psychology rather than in physical evidence. Experts point out how isolation affects the mind, how small communities under pressure can form alliances and rivalries that outsiders rarely understand, how ambition, jealousy, or fear can grow heavier when there is nowhere to escape. Floreana, remote and unforgiving, became a perfect study of what happens when big personalities collide in a small space. Modern analysts revisit Dor's writing and compare it with Margaret Wittmer's calm recollections. They note contradictions, differences in tone, gaps that could be explained by trauma or by memory reshaped over time. Historians emphasize that both women endured hardship, illness, and grief, and that stories told under such conditions can shift like dunes in wind. Documentarians still return to the island with cameras, hoping to find some overlooked clue, a buried object, an abandoned path, a trace that might settle one unanswered question. But Floreana yields little. Nature erases quickly. Memory erases slowly. And the two forces together create a mystery that lives just beyond reach. Perhaps that is why the story endures, not because it can be solved, but because it cannot. In a world where answers are often demanded, Floreana remains content to whisper instead. Visitors stepping onto Floreana in the present century often describe a feeling that is difficult to put into words. The island is peaceful, filled with giant tortoises, bright finches, and black rock warmed by the sun. Yet beneath the calm lies a presence, not of ghosts, but of human history, resting lightly on the landscape. The Wittmer family still plays a role in island life. Their small lodge offers travelers a glimpse of early settlement, where possessions are few and sunsets provide the evening entertainment. Guests often ask about the Baroness, about Ritter, about Dor. The replies are polite, cautious, shaped by decades of retelling and restraint. Hikers can follow the route to the old homesteads. Some sections of the trail are marked. Others fade into volcanic stone. Standing where the Baroness once lived, visitors note how exposed the site is, open to wind, watched by ridges, far from water. It becomes easier to imagine how tempers flared, how pride hardened, how isolation cut more sharply than any knife. Wildlife thrives where human ambition once faltered. Blue-footed boobies nest on the cliffs, sea turtles glide through clear water, and sea lions sleep where philosophical disputes once echoed. Nature continues with indifference, unconcerned with human mysteries. As darkness falls, the island becomes almost otherworldly. The stars appear without city glow. The silence deepens, and the memory of the settler seems to hover just beyond hearing. Floreana today is both paradise and parable, unchanged in its beauty, forever marked by its past. The story of the Galápagos Affair does not end with answers, but with understanding. It teaches that paradise is not a place, but a balance, and that when personalities clash in isolation, even the most beautiful landscape can become a crucible. Ritter arrived seeking purity, Dor seeking transformation, the Wittmers seeking stability, Lorenz seeking escape, the Baroness seeking fame. Each found something different. Some found purpose, some found conflict, some found tragedy, and some found a home that would outlast the rest. The truth behind the disappearances may never be known. No investigator can recreate every footstep. No diary can record every motive. No memory can remain untouched by time. What remains is the echo of human nature under pressure, preserved on an island where silence says more than any spoken testimony. As we leave Floreana in this story, imagine the volcanic cliffs fading behind us, the sea rising and falling beneath the boat, the wind carrying faint traces of voices from 1934, not ghosts, but memories of people who dreamed too boldly, demanded too much, or feared too deeply. This is the legacy of the Galapagos Affair, a reminder that mysteries endure not because they lack facts, but because they reveal the fragile edges of the human heart. Thank you for joining this journey through paradise and paradox. And as always, if you enjoy traveling through true mysteries like this one, consider returning for our next voyage into the strange, the historical, and the unexplained, where another story waits just beyond the horizon.